let's get started on the last section of this tutorial. So I'm Alex Kendall, and I'm here from Cambridge University. I'm going to be talking about machine learning for visual localization. So hopefully this is a natural extension to what you've heard so far. In case you've just walked in, this talk's all about trying to get a 6-degree of freedom camera pose from an image, from a query image in a previously explored area. So I think there's a few key assumptions that I want to test in this talk. I think that Torsten's given a great introduction of some point-based feature methods, but I think there's some ideas in there that maybe there are some other ways to localize, and maybe there's some orthogonal line of thought that I'd like to question. So first of all, I'd really like to pose the question: are point-based feature descriptors the right landmarks to be using for localization? A lot of the problems that have been discussed in these talks is that these features aren't that unique, and actually getting really good matches with them takes a number of features. We have to do things like ransack, we have to do lots of filtering, and we have to store a very large map of these features. And we have to do all these things to get a pose estimate. Now, can we do better? Can we use features which are better than say SIFT, ORB, or SURF, these sort of hand-engineered features that we're using today? So I don't know if anyone can localize this image here, but this is an image of our university back in Cambridge. And the way that we might localize an image like this is through a whole bunch of things that don't just involve single corner features. We don't look at the individual spires and windows, but we take in the whole image as the entire context of the image. We can detect contours, shape, structure of the scene, and all of these to build up a representation that's perhaps more contains richer information than these individual features on their own. So I think that's one of the core ideas that I've been reflecting on is actually, is there a better way of building these descriptors? And as we've been hearing for the last 5 years, perhaps machine learning is the way to go. It's going to be very hard to hand engineer some descriptors that can describe all of these things that we use as humans to localize, geometry, shape, contour, appearance, these kind of things. And so maybe machine learning's the tool to be used here. The next point that I'd like to raise is, should our maps be Euclidean? In these previous methods, we've been talking about big structure from motion models that we try and register to. There is work being done in quantizing them into visual descriptors. But I think there's this general idea that perhaps our maps can be not just quantized Euclidean areas, but perhaps we can have a better feature space than simply a 3-dimensional structure from motion model. I think this is an easy argument to make, because if you just simply plot a heat map of where we go, then it's not uniform. It's very peaky. We tend to walk in streets, for example, and not everywhere is important as everywhere else. And there needs to be some kind of I think the map representation could do a lot better than simply based on 3D structure. So that's the other assumption I'd like to test: is can we learn an embedding or a description of a place that is perhaps more efficient than 3D space. Now, it's always good to consider how we do this ourselves, or how this happens in the animal kingdom. And this is actually a really interesting story in localization. We don't know very well how humans localize, but in fact, in 2014, the Nobel Prize was awarded to Edvard and May Moser from Sweden, I think, and John O'Keefe. And this is so very recently, only in 2014, this was the Nobel Prize for discovering the method for localization in mammals. And basically, this is down to 2 types of cells: both place cells, which fire depending on our position and orientation, and is more of a topological localization method. And these are found in the hippocampus. And then also grid cells, which these encode more fine-grained Euclidean geometry, and is more to do with relative pose to different objects in a local Euclidean scene. And so it's interesting to reflect on how this happens in biology, where there is this disconnect between local Euclidean understanding and also a topological place recognition. And the brain's able to do this pretty reliably at large scale. So to give an overview of this talk, I think this is a great slide to describe the contents of how perhaps divide up how localization exists today and what the literature is for machine learning for localization. So we've been hearing about 3 different steps in metric localization. We have this feature extraction step, which Torsten described beautifully about taking out point features. Then we have a landmark registration where we've got to associate these features with a 3D model. And then finally, we've got the 6DOF pose estimation, which in Torsten's talk involve things like filtering, ransack, these kind of ideas. So in my talk, I'd like to introduce 2 more methods. The first one is to do with scene coordinate regression. And this is a method which basically does these first 2 with machine learning. And it tries to solve the feature extraction and registration problem with a machine learning model. So that's the first part. Then the second part, I'd like to consider, well, can we actually learn the entire pipeline itself? And can we go straight from images to a 6 degree of freedom pose estimation and actually learn the entire thing with deep learning? So let me kick off the first part. So this is all about scene coordinate regression. So what is that? So scene coordinate regression is the idea of, can we, for a given image, can we determine the 3D points in a given coordinate system of each pixel? Now this is this can be thought of as solving the registration problem. So not only are we simply getting descriptors that we need to match, but we're actually matching them to a 3D model. And so this is a picture of a scene from Jamie Schotten's work, where the RGB colors are corresponding to the XYZ of the scene. And so you can see that. So in the following slide, this is showing an example of how the system works. So we go from an input image. This middle image is showing what the ground truth looks like when you start to think about every pixel being an XYZ coordinate. And then finally, this is from the paper presented a few days ago at this conference, was what state of the art is today of being able to predict scene coordinates. And so this is a very neat idea because it's asking a machine learning model to be able to predict the correspondences itself and actually say, for each pixel, this is the XYZ location. And once we have a number of these, we can then use them to aggregate and to get a hypothesis for our camera pose. So this idea was, well, at least the first time I heard about it was from Jamie Schotten's work, first presented back at CVPR in 2013. And what they proposed was to collect some data of small indoor scenes using Kinect Fusion from a Kinect camera, an RGBD camera, and use Kinect Fusion to create ground truth camera pose labels. They then suggest to train a regression forest to be able to go from these RGBD images to predict scene coordinate labels. And they train on depth-aware features. So their features fed into the forest were aware of their depth, and they were trained on sort of very basic random forest features. But what this forest was trained to do was to predict these XYZ locations for each pixel. And so this is really bringing the registration problem inside a machine learning model. And so in this initial work, it was very noisy. Using random forests produced very noisy camera hypotheses. And if you were to pick a random sample of points and try and generate camera hypotheses, you get a very noisy collection as shown in this image here. So the idea then is to take to use ransack and to randomly sample and reduce these until you get a set of inliers that match with a credible hypothesis. And so this was the idea that Jamie Schotten presented, to take these RGBD images, run them through random forests, and get these inliers to infer camera pose. As you can see from the inliers, it's very sparse, so you don't get sort of a globally consistent estimate with this method, but it can be fairly robust when you run it through this ransack pipeline. So the data set they showed these results on was a whole bunch of 7 small indoor scenes where there were about 2,000 to 6,000 images in each scene and a few thousand test images. And these scenes ranged from about 3 by 3 meters sort of spatial area within office spaces, kitchens, stairwells, these kind of scenes. What they could show is that this was able to outperform SIF-based approaches where you take key points and try and register it to a 3D model. And so this is showing that in these small constrained environments, actually learning these first 2 stages in the localization pipeline and learning the registration can outperform these traditional methods, which is a really exciting result. So the baseline sparse RGB was the baseline method of matching to a structure from motion model. The three results that I'm showing here from their paper are using different types of depth features into the random forest networks. And you can see that they achieve fairly good percentage of frames to be under 5 centimeters and 5 degrees angular error. So this is these metrics are also looking to go beyond the location recognition, but also now to what we're really after is metric error and how good is the metric relocalization. So following this work, there's been a whole bunch of very exciting improvements, which I'm just going to briefly describe to you. So the first one is a paper called Random Forest versus Neural Networks, What's Best for Camera Relocalization? And that explores, that's follow-on work exploring doing that with both random forests and neural networks, and which one is actually better to generate these scene coordinate, to regress the scene coordinate labels. And interestingly, they found that random forests in their setting worked better, and that although neural networks were able to produce a better estimate of the scene coordinates, when you then pass it through RANSAC, it produced worse performance. And they have a method for combining them both. Another paper following on from that was called Uncertainty-Driven 6D Pose Estimation. And this was presented at CVPR last year. And the exciting thing here is they showed that they can actually do this with just RGB images. So this is throwing away the depth modality and now doing localization with just color images. And they could show a similar thing where they can learn to regress score labels from there. And then finally, I'm sure you've all seen the paper this year at CVPR, which then looks to complete the end-to-end machine learning architecture and then actually formulate the RANSAC part as a differentiable machine as well. And that's very exciting because I'm showing a picture of the results at the bottom from that paper, and you can see that they get much more of a dense inlier set where you get really a consistent estimate of the scene coordinate labels on the whole scene. And this is now using deep learning, so it's going beyond the very basic features you get out of random forests. So to summarize this section, well, what are the good things about this? Well, by going straight from the images to a registered scene coordinates, this is great because now we don't need a Euclidean map. We're not relying on a 3D structure for motion model, but instead we're relying on a machine learning model to implicitly encode features and say, learn a mapping from the pixels in the appearance space through to a registered 3D context. And so this is great because it scales efficiently because this map is now encoded in a more efficient feature space. But what are some of the problems? Well, learning scene coordinates today doesn't use global context. So this is applying a machine learning model on a local area to try and describe, say, for each pixel, describe the local scene coordinate. But we're still not getting to the global context that in the motivation I said that we really want from these machine learning models. And secondly, perhaps you could argue that the paper this year addresses this to some extent, but in general, the inliers are still noisy, and perhaps RANSAC isn't such a reliable technique. Maybe there's a better way that we can more cleverly choose which hypotheses to sample from. And so this is perhaps motivating further work here. So that brings me to the second part of the talk, which is about now can we go from directly from images to camera pose directly through a machine learning model. But first, are there any questions about the scene coordinate regression section? Great. Okay. So in this work, I'm going to start talking about a model that we proposed a couple of years ago at ICCV called PoseNet. And this as an initial model is really after the idea: can we learn a mapping directly from the input image to the 6th degree of freedom pose? Now, this is a very complicated mapping because it's going from appearance space to a space which is linear with respect to pose. But what we're able to show is that you can actually learn this with a deep learning model. So what we did is we took a pre-trained classification model. It could be any of them, but in this case we chose GooglerNet and trained it to regress a 6th degree of freedom pose from an input image. And this was trained with a simple regression loss function where we had a weighted sum of a Euclidean loss around position as a 3-dimensional XYZ vector and an orientation as a 4-dimensional quaternion. And so yeah, this worked pretty well out of the box. We were able to leverage a pre-trained model on ImageNet. So we had some features which were a fairly smooth manifold and then fine tune it to become a regression network. So this is showing the kind of results you get. So this is a top-down view of some localization data that we were trying to train on. In green is the training data. So you can see that there are a number of distinct sequences from different times of day and different weather conditions. And then blue is the testing sequence. And so this ground truth was obtained through a structure for motion model with bundle adjustment on the entire data set. Now in red is showing the results from PoseNet, and you can see that the network's able to, one of the exciting things I thought when I first saw these results was it's able to actually regress a somewhat smooth pose manifold. So it's not simply learning a classification result. It's not taking a query image and trying to find the nearest neighbor in the training image, but it's able to interpolate successfully and learn a manifold which is somewhat smooth. The other great thing about these features is that they do use a lot more context. So because we're taking input images and we're learning a mapping straight to pose regression, these features through the convolutional network are aggregated from the entire image. So in this example with the Google architecture, we're taking the image and we're passing it through a number of layers, and we're convolving and forming features which rely on the entire image. As we've seen with other deep learning fields, these features are able to fire off shape, global context, appearance, and they're much more robust to the sort of nuisance variables that we observe in real life data. And so these are some results showing that we're able to register to a coordinate system in a way that's much more accurate. We can deal with blur in these situations, such as blur when you have heavy occlusion. The third example of dusk is a situation that is very, very hard for point descriptors. And what the model is able to do is it's able to build descriptions based on, or a feature based on shape and contour. And that by using these features, it can work in situations like this. And to a limited extent at night. So I'm looking forward to testing it out on Torsten's dataset when it's released. Yes, of course. So there is overlap with spatial location. However, the sequences are taken from different times of day, so they are different in appearance space. So you can see in the left and right images, the weather is going to be different. There's going to be pedestrians and other clutter that's going to be different. So it's not the same in appearance space. There are some examples which are very similar in pose space, but then there are others that aren't. So there is an aspect to that, yes. I just want to show some results from another paper that was placed on arXiv last year, and this paper obtained a data set which was sort of like an adversarial data set to some of the point-based feature localization methods. So we know that they really struggle in indoor environments when you have, say, some very featureless surfaces that might be non-Lambertian. And there's some images from some of their data set. We have an area which is very much void of features. And what they could show is that at least the methods they tried using SIF-based features, they didn't work. They couldn't form a registered 3D model. I think they obtained, I'm not sure how they obtained ground truth, but they used another method perhaps. But one of the exciting things is that the features learned from the deep learning model are able to localize in these kind of scenarios. So this is more evidence that the features do actually learn contour, appearance, shape, and things at a higher level than simply corner features that individual SIFT or SURF landmarks might capture. And then they go further to describe a model which I'm going to discuss soon, which actually improves on the original PoseNet model and gets the error down to almost a meter and a few degrees. So some more insight about this model, which learns straight from camera pose to straight from image to camera pose, is you can also start to look at the saliency. So the saliency of the model is asking for each pixel how much does it affect the output. So which pixels are most important in determining the pose. And this is showing some results over a number of images, and you can start to see some really interesting patterns when you look at these saliency images. Firstly, by training straight from images to camera pose, the model learns to to not only grab corner features like in the left image, like the spire, but it actually looks at the sky and it looks at the context and it checks that, yes, the sky is at the top and that it's not just the edge, but it's also the context around the edge, not just these corners of the spires and the facade. In the middle image, you can see that dynamic objects like people and cars are attenuated, and that the brighter white color indicates more saliency to the facade, which is perhaps more reliable for localization. And you can see a similar result on the right where it attenuates the pedestrians. So this is more evidence that the features that we can learn are perhaps more powerful than these individual individual point feature landmarks. I'm pulling some results here from another paper called Towards Convolutional Neural Network Map Compression for Camera Relocalization. And this paper is interesting because it looks at the relationship of how these networks scale. So this is another benefit of this method, is that we scale almost constantly with the amount of training data. So the more training data you pump in, at test time, we're still running a single forward pass of the network. So it has a constant number of network parameters and a constant inference time. But as you pump in more training data, of course, as these graphs show, the results get better and you start to learn a better representation for that data. And so one of the exciting things about these networks is they scale almost constantly with training data for a given network size in terms of inference penalty, but you can, of course, improve performance by adding additional training data. So to summarize, the original PoseNet model is fairly robust to different aspects because it can learn features which are richer than what we might get from point features. It has very fast inference and a very small memory size because it's able to learn a compact representation of the map with a deep learning model. But I'm going to discuss the accuracy soon. Unfortunately, the accuracy is and I'm the first to admit this, it's not quite at what we get from these feature-based methods. And there's also a difficulty between learning both position and orientation in the same model. And this is a multitask learning problem. So to go over the multitask learning problem, the way that PoseNet was originally trained was with a model which trained on both Euclidean loss on regression on position and orientation. And the problem is that you need a weighting factor between these to learn both of them effectively. And this graph shows the performance of both position and orientation as you vary this weighting factor. And as you can see on the far left, you're basically just training position, but your orientation performs very poorly. And on the far right, you're just training orientation, but your position performs poorly. And so there's an optimal weighting where you get the best performance. And you can understand the relationship between these, because if you have geometry, which is very far away, then you obviously care about rotation more, because position isn't going to affect the reprojection error very much. But if you have geometry very close to you, then you can care about translation more. And so this is what, well, at least in the original work, was required to be hand-tuned. So a few days ago, we presented a paper which tries to extend this and tries to either learn or infer the weighting from the scene's geometry. So we propose to do this by introducing a loss function, which takes the 3D geometry of the scene, whether it's from a depth camera or a structure from motion model or otherwise, and train rather on the Euclidean loss of the pose, rather we want to train on the reprojection error of that geometry. So that's saying, can we take these 3D points and take our network's estimated camera pose and ground truth pose and reproject the 3D points to both of those spaces and train on the disparity or the registration loss in image space. So this is a loss function which is aware of the geometry and naturally combines both position and orientation into a single scalar regression value. So now I'd like to talk about some results. Firstly, just to introduce some data sets. The first data set we're showing results from is from the Cambridge Landmarks data set. This has 6 scenes from around Cambridge University with 8,000 images. And the scenes vary from around sort of a small shop facade to an entire street. And so they're small urban scenes. The next data set is the one I discussed earlier with 7 small indoor scenes. And then finally, the Dubrovnik data set, which has been extensively discussed already today. And this has 6,000 images from a variety of camera types around a small town. So when we start to look at the results, at the top I'm showing where it says linear sum, that's the results from the original PoseNet work. And you can see that on small urban scenes, we're able to get the error down to a few meters and a few degrees. On Dubrovnik, which is the larger small city data set, the errors are over 10 meters and about 5 degrees. Now, I won't run through all these results, but jumping down to the most recent work using this reprojection error as a loss function, we can now pull the results down to, with the median across the test set, under a meter relocalization error and about a degree. And this corresponds to 90% of the data, of the query data being localized in under 2 meters and 5 degrees error. Again, on Dubrovnik, the localization is worse across this largest scene, but we're able to get 8 meters and 5 degrees. And so this is not quite good enough for augmented reality applications, but because it's more robust and efficient, it's starting to become appealing for sort of a coarse localization estimate that you can use. When you start to compare it to the active search method that Torsten introduced, it's still quite a wee way off, maybe on the small scenes a factor of 2 off the performance of that. So the performance is coming down, but it's still not there to what the traditional methods can do. But we're hopeful with some more research that this might come down even further. But you can start to look at other aspects of the network. So like I've tried to show some evidence for, it's perhaps more robust, and that initial question that I posed to you of what is the best map representation? Should it be Euclidean? Well, by learning a feature representation and learning this map space, we can show that it's also more efficient. When you compare the methods, PoseNet only requires a very small resolution image of 256 by 256 pixels, and 2 milliseconds is a single forward pass through a neural network to localize. On the other hand, these geometry-based methods require tens or hundreds of milliseconds and very large resolution images to compute their features. But on the other hand, the trade-off is in today's performance, they also get a far more accurate registration. So there are lots of questions here of how can we further improve performance, and how can we scale it? How can we get the performance we see on the small urban scenes on the larger, say the Dubrovnik data set? So finally, I'd just like to run through a few more papers which extend this work and show other interesting aspects of this machine learning approach of going straight from images to camera pose. So there's work that shows how to model uncertainty in these networks, how to understand the compression and what the space that we learn to map the map in, how to improve the context of features, video localization, ego motion localization, and localization over RGBD frames. So the first one, I'm very excited about this work, which is a paper which shows how to improve the context of these features. So in the initial motivation, one of the things I question is, can we improve the context of the features and go beyond what these small scale, say, SIFT feature landmarks can give us? So what this paper proposes to do is takes this original idea of mapping images to camera pose, but instead of the original network simply pooling these features and then applying a simple regression, what this proposes to do is have a recurrent layer that has an LSTM that trawls across the spatial dimensions of the feature. And so this is a way of spatially aggregating the feature and trying to have a better way of understanding the spatial relationship of the features in the image. And so one of the exciting things they can show is across some of these data sets that have been introduced, they improve the metric localization performance by about 5 to 50% across the data sets. So this shows that I mean, before I was talking about changing the loss function to use geometry and a reprojection error. So this paper is a complementary idea where it develops on the architecture and tries to improve the spatial context of these features. It shows that there's a lot to be gained by going from just out of the box classification architectures, but now going to architectures which can gather more context in the features. The next one I'd like to talk about is in modeling uncertainty. So this is a paper which is able to use a Bayesian neural network to understand the uncertainty in relocalization. And one of the nice things is you can show that this uncertainty is a really good estimate for the metric localization error. And then secondly, it can also show if the model is familiar with an image it's shown. So this is known as the loop closure problem. Have I been to a place, have I seen this place before, or is this a new place? And model uncertainty, the graph on the right shows a very strong correlation between model uncertainty and distance to, and relationship to that image. So if it's a new image from a new scene or outside the scene we've trained on, then this is a really nice way of detecting that from these models. And when you start to look at the images at the bottom from the Cambridge landmarks dataset that are very uncertain, you see that they're like the adversarial examples we know about: overexposed, nighttime, occlusion, or featureless areas. And so this is uncertainty in neural networks is a way to detect that. The next work I'd like to talk about is extending PoseNet to work over video sequences. So this is an idea of having PoseNet and then taking the feature vector at the top and running a recurrent model on top over video. And what they can show is that this acts like a filtering method, and it's able to smooth the estimate over a number of frames and give a nice temporally consistent pose estimate. So just to show some results on the right, you can see that the yellow is the ground truth, and in red is the original per frame PoseNet, and then their network vidlock is able to give in blue a much smoother pose estimate that filters and has some temporal consistency by modeling the features with a recurrent neural network. And lastly, some work that I can mention is this work's all about using RGBD images. And so in an indoor environment, they take images such as from a Kinect camera and try to localize. And what they propose to do is have two separate networks, one that operates on the color features and one that operates on the depth features, and then combine them in feature space later on, and then again try and regress camera pose. They show an incremental improvement over just the RGB network. So to summarize this talk, as any good talk, I hope it provokes more questions than answers. And maybe these are some points that I've been thinking about in my research that I'd like to share. So firstly, what these results can show is that actually maybe learning a map representation can give us a more efficient map than Euclidean, and maybe we should consider being able to learn something which has a space which is more efficient and more effective to localize in. Secondly, using convolutional features allows us to be more robust to environmental challenges, so things like occlusion, night, daytime, lighting, these kind of things. If we have it in the training data and we can learn features which have global context, then this is going to improve our localization result. But there's so many more research questions, which I hope this might motivate some of you to take on board. Firstly, the accuracy is still not as good as these traditional methods. So how do we really push the boundaries here and try and get the accuracy down to an area that's almost good enough for augmented reality? Secondly, how do we scale it? PoseNet out of the box doesn't work on the San Francisco data set, and so how can we extend these models up to a city scale? How can we learn this map online? So at the moment, this requires offline training from data, and then we can go and relocalize, but it'd be really interesting to consider localization in more of a SLAM perspective. And then finally, how do we even obtain these data sets? Because if we're using structure for motion for labels, then perhaps that might set a lower bound for the accuracy we can obtain. And so I think there's some really interesting questions about active learning and how we can effectively obtain large data sets. So thank you. Here's some of the papers that I've worked on, and maybe I can talk about in more detail, or I'm happy to answer high-level questions about the other papers that I've read. But thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks. Yeah, so I think, there's been some really interesting work on generating images through, for example, generative adversarial networks, GAN networks, to generate different images from different scenes. I'm sure that would be a really interesting approach. Other synthetic augmentations you can do are, if you can build a dense 3D model to be able to reproject novel viewpoints. All these kind of ideas about synthetically increasing training data, I think, are great. You've got to be careful not to introduce bias through this synthetic generation, but yeah, I think that's one way of tackling the data problem. Yes.
Hi. On the in the loss for PoseNet, in your rotation loss, I noticed you're trying to regress a normalized quaternion, and I was wondering whether you had tried just trying to regress a quaternion that you then normalize in the loss, which gives your network a bit more freedom, and whether you tried any other rotation parameterizations.
So we have tried both a normalized and unnormalized quaternion, and in practice we didn't notice anything significantly different in the results. So I'm experimentally we didn't see any difference there. Perhaps when you start to converge, the Riemannian manifold and the Euclidean manifold start to become quite similar. But in an unconverged state, there might be an issue there, but experimentally we don't see one. In terms of rotation representation, I think this is a really interesting problem. If we could move to, because obviously quaternions are over-parameterized, and within the rotation sphere, they doubly map each rotation, which is an issue. So moving towards something like learning directly an SE3 matrix or something like that would be nice. We've tried to do this. You can, for example, learn an exponential map, but this has a lot of these methods, like exponential map, have a discontinuity or a point they break down, for example. And so finding a rotation representation which doesn't suffer from a discontinuity or doesn't have something that repeats around, for example, 2 pi, like axis angle does, this is challenging, and these are all trade-offs to make. In our experiments, we found quaternions to work the best, but I very much think this is an open research question on how to parameterize rotation.
Did you say you tried the rotation matrix, or that's something you'd like to try?
No, so we've tried the rotation matrix by learning a 3-dimensional vector and then applying the exponential map to an SE3 matrix.
Okay, but you haven't tried to learn directly the 9 parameters of a rotation matrix.
So to do that, you need to constrain your matrices to be orthogonal. That's non-trivial.
You weren't constraining your quaternion to be normalized. You were training it to be normalized. So you could, if you simply try to train the rotation matrix and then project it onto SO3, once you've regressed it, that could potentially work.
That could. I'd be interested to see some results here. It's not something we've tried. So the question was about how it works if we train on one city or one scene and then move to another one. So obviously this is relocalization, so it can't localize an area it doesn't have data for. But the interesting thing is the map you learn from one city, like you see in a lot of transfer learning papers, provides a very good feature to use in another one. And so one of the things we found is that training on a lot of data for one scene will provide a very good pre-trained model to use in another one. In another scene. And so the features you learn and the low-level features tend to be complementary between scenes, but of course the absolute coordinate frame and the regression you apply at the top will need to be learnt per scene. Torsten, what's the plan from here? Sorry, we might have to take the rest of the questions offline, but thanks very much.
The plan from here would be, if there are no further questions to Alex specifically, if there are any questions from you that you would like to have the opinions from all of us, so more broad questions about the relation between the individual parts of the tutorials, we'd be happy to answer this. If there are no more questions, then we would be very thankful for you to attending our tutorial. But yes, if there are questions, please feel free to ask them. Okay, that's you. Specific questions.
Sure. So this is a question about the end-to-end learning part for post-regression. So once the feature correspondences are established, it's a very deterministic problem to get the posts out of it. And I'm wondering why in that case would you try and do end-to-end learning, because at that point the problem can be solved geometrically.
So I think this comes to the motivation at the start about, firstly, do we need to have a 3D or Euclidean map? And so yes, it can be solved geometrically, and maybe this is appropriate on a small scale for accurate small scale relative pose, but on a large scale, I think there are much more efficient map representations we can have, and we can form features that aren't explicitly geometric. They may be more topological. and this is something that's going to be very hard to hand engineer. So the motivation there is really to try and learn a map representation, which is, maybe a feed-forward neural network isn't the best way. It's one way of doing it, but learning a map representation which is more efficient. Are there any more questions? Yes.
Hi, I apologize if this was already covered in the morning talk. I was unable to attend. But for landmark recognition, my understanding is that the work last year, which uses the RMAC feature descriptor and trains a Siamese network, at least in 2016, that was the state of the art on the Oxford and the Paris data sets. And I was just wondering if anything was covered about improving on that. That's the first question. And the second question is, we've seen that approach does really well on man-made structures, but on natural landmarks, presumably because there aren't like very distinguishing features, it tends not to do as well. And so I was wondering if there was like what your thoughts were on research as far as natural landmark recognition goes.
So, is it working? So about the first part of the question, it was about improvements on top of end-to-end learning of a representation such as RMAC. Well, one thing is that NetVLAD, that is somehow like a concurrent work. It was applied and trained on location recognition on kind of different data sets, like Street View data sets. So that's an embedding that also in the work it's shown that it's better than just doing global max pooling. So it's an embedding that has some extra cost to train and also some larger memory requirements. But because of the finer matching it in terms of local descriptors that it does, it obtains better performance. So that's one case. Other cases, such as work that was part of CVPR 17, is including a layer that is kind of attention model that better adapts and better weights the activations at each location of the feature map. So about the second part of the question about, it was about matching natural landmarks, right? And not man-made buildings, which is something indeed that we have not considered in prior work. However, what we observe is that already this is something that was not handled well with local feature-based approaches and geometric matching, and already CNN-based representation gives you better features discriminative enough to capture such kind of variances. So that's a better way to go. But indeed there is nothing considered so far in
Thank you.
the literature. So thank you once more for attending our tutorial. So since there are no more questions, we'll finish this for them.